Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Relating to DevSecOps, where we explore the development, security, and operational issues of today so that we can solve real-world problems with people that face them. I'm your host, Ken Toller, and I'm joined again by my co-host, Mike McCabe, for episode number 68 of Relating to DevSecOps, and we're going to jump into the world of software as a service in the world of cloud, which is, I think, an often overlooked area of cloud security. What do you think, Mike? This is something you brought to the table, so give us a little intro into what you're thinking here.
Yeah, I brought this up because you and I both spend a lot of time in the cloud security world, spend a lot of time in the AppSec world, obviously. We read a lot of the news, we go to a lot of conferences and hear people talk about these things, and they talk about cloud security a lot. They talk about on-prem, server-based security, things like that. We don't talk a huge amount about SaaS security. Single company, we're a small company and we use 10 plus providers. I know a lot of our customers use probably 100 different providers, and I think that's pretty true across the board from small companies to large companies. And I think it's just an area that doesn't get as much focus as it probably should. And it's also a really challenging area to secure. So wanted to bring it up to kind of chat about some of the things that we have both seen and things we try to address there.
Cool. So, this is a DevSecOps podcast. We're relating to DevSecOps. Tell me, how do you think that SaaS comes into the world of DevSecOps?
Didn't even give me a chance to ask you that question. Didn't even give me a chance.
No, I'm turning it to you. This is on you.
I mean, I think as we talked about before, I think obviously data security is part of DevSecOps. Automation is a huge part, and SaaS is definitely an area you have to automate. If you have 100 different tools that are out there, and you're managing authentication, if you're managing data, if you're managing all your different configurations, you can't have someone, no matter what size the security team, you can't have them sitting there clicking buttons all day long. So you have to automate a lot of that work. You have to do a lot of the monitoring on your own as well. One of the big challenges in SaaS security is so many things are locked behind licenses. As a company, pretty often too, where we want to get more in-depth insight into our SaaS providers, and you have to pay for the highest tier Uber license to get access to that. And the price is triple, 5 times as much as the license that we actually need. And we see this kind of across the board. It's not just a small or mid-sized company issue. We see this in a lot of places. There's that website dedicated to just shaming websites about the SSO tax. Same thing, people charge for MFA, charge for SSO. And logging is another area that they'd really force you into the highest level contract to get you access to those logs. A friend of ours, Evan Johnson, has a SIEM startup, and he's run into the same thing where in order to actually integrate logs from your SaaS tools, you have to pay for the highest license. So you don't get security unless you pay for a license you don't really need most of except for that one feature. So it's really difficult. So we end up having to build automations around these things to basically bypass some of those issues to get some of the data out, maybe through means that weren't expected by the SaaS provider, but they intentionally make it hard for you to get this information out, which is really security critical.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, it used to be that we were always seeing people charge for security features, and I do think that there is a healthy move towards getting vendors to think about including security features as part of their product, especially when we're talking about secure by default, secure by design. These are all concepts that we've been talking about on this show for a while in the world of DevSecOps. But vendors, if you're a vendor that charges for security features, it becomes it's going to be a difficult. It's going to be difficult to hold that, I think in the coming years, because it's becoming a standalone requirement for enterprises and for the individual. I mean, if you look at even Slack, has been forcing MFA for any workspace administrators recently because it makes your product look bad if you're offering an insecure version, at a cheaper price. Like, why wouldn't you give that to the lower cost? And I think, like, as a vendor, I just don't understand the strategy, if I'm being honest. It's because it makes your product more attractive if you have these security features baked in and you're not having that debate with people, because we're like past that at this stage. And if you're not doing it, then you're putting your users at risk, which just ultimately puts you on the risk table for looking bad in the future. I just don't, I'm not really clear on why vendors do it. I can understand maybe like 5 or 6 years ago when this wasn't so well accepted to like have, for personal security and privacy, back in the day. But now, I mean, I think it's an ancient perspective to not include this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it just feels like nickel and diming people to make a little bit more money, which probably works in some ways, but it definitely makes you look bad. And I mean, you can't say that you're a trustworthy SaaS provider who takes data security seriously and then charge for MFA or charge for SSO or keep all the logs hidden behind, a paywall, and basically tell your small to medium sized customers like, yeah, you can't have access to that. You don't have the budget, you can't have access to it. So if there is a security incident related to that tool, you're just kind of in the dark. It's unfortunate, and people have to change their mentalities there. Like, make your money on the quality of your product, not on a couple of security features.
And it makes, I think the loss thing, as both a buyer and a seller, from my perspective, I'm very much aligning myself and clients with vendors that include these things, because it makes everyone's sales process easier if you're just like, oh, that just comes with it. How much extra do we have to pay? Even if the product is more expensive and comes with it out of the gate, eliminates a lot of the churn you have to have in the conversation, because you're like, okay, well, this one costs less, and it causes more frustration on the other side too, because if you're talking to somebody and you're like, hey, I have these 3 tools and these all do the things that we have, and one shows up cheaper than the other, but it doesn't have the security features, you almost like just ignore it, because there's no reason to bring it to the table, because in order to get the real pricing, you have to have a conversation, then they set up the demo and they want to show you all these things. It's just a time suck. Like, there is, I feel like there's so many lost opportunities to not having security by default in your products, fundamentally. And I mean, I truly believe that that's where we're going. If you're not doing it this way, or at least on the way to doing it, I think that you're going to be behind.
Yeah. I mean, we have a client who has basically a checklist for new SaaS providers, and one of the first questions is, can you export the logs into, their log solution? And if that's answered no, doesn't matter how good the tool is, doesn't matter what VP is pushing for it. It can be the next gen of next gen AI solutions, and it's just a straight up no, because they drew a line in that area, which is good, because it forces the conversation to the vendors. They like, find a solution, don't charge extra for it. But they're also kind of a large company, so they have a little more leverage. If you're a small, even 50-person company, and you can't afford that highest tier license, you're just getting strong armed by SaaS providers. And let's be honest, it doesn't cost them a huge amount of money to expose those logs. It's not that big of a deal. They have the functionality built out. Yep. It's just part of their licensing model to not enable it for you. So
especially now. I mean,
yeah.
So moving on from the tie of old ways to these SaaS providers, let's talk about some of the other issues that we would face in SaaS providers that might relate. I faced an issue recently with shadow IT, and I would say that if you look at desktop software versus SaaS software today, I would say that a lot of the requests coming in, or a lot of the discoveries that we have, are on SaaS providers that are being used by semi-technical or some technical individuals. And I think that it really does enable this view of shadow IT now, that we used to have we used to look at shadow IT as like people spinning up a server, under their desk, or which we've all seen and maybe we've all done. I don't know. And then the other piece of it is that with desktop software, you used to be able to control a lot of this, because with MDM and being able to have enterprise machines, you're able to sort of control what software goes in the computer. But I think that companies have been moving further and further away from that. So you have all kinds of SaaS providers that people are using on trial versions or single user versions. You have things like Miro and Guru and Jira boards, and people running their to-do lists, and all these SaaS providers that are showing up in people's browsers that we don't have control over. What's your perspective on that as a risk, and is that kind of where your head was going at all when we talked about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that it's not just the Google Drives, it's not just like the Box.com type of issues. It's like, let me attach this file to my to-do list so I make sure that I remember to come back to it. And that file could have, sensitive company data, it could have, client data, and someone just kind of doesn't think through the impact of attaching that file, which most likely gets sent up to some S3 bucket that vendor's using to store, user files. And that system might have just become PCI, could have just gotten HIPAA data. People are very lackadaisical about data security a lot of times, but it's really easy to pay your $15 a month for some service and then attach a file. And as a security person, it's really hard to find these things. People have talked about looking for like introduction to new tool emails from their email admin, looking for recurring charges on people's company credit cards to find these things. But a lot of it is also educating users to make sure, like, hey, this is sensitive data. We trust these systems with those. Yeah, it sucks you can't, use like the fancy new to-do list because it hasn't gone through your vendor approval list yet, but there's a good reason we're not trusting it with all of our company data. So it's definitely a tough thing to deal with because the scale is so big.
Yeah, I mean, one of the organic things that you can do is first to try to inventory the vendor list. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for this product, but I very much have enjoyed this particular feature of a product, which is I've recently been working through a trial of Vanta, and they have a vendor discovery capability. And I know that there's other vendors that do this, but this was the one that I first seen. And so if you have MDM and Vanta integrates with your MDM, then Vanta will populate all of the software that you don't necessarily know about and put them into your vendor list. And you can get hundreds of sort of vendors and shadow IT installations that you may not have known about before. But this is not necessarily a way for you to slap your users on the wrist. I think one of the interesting things that you can expose is what are the things that we should probably have enterprise licensing for. So if you don't have an enterprise license of like Airtable or Lattice or Miro or Lucidchart or whatever, then seeing these applications on your users' machines is an indicator that you may want to consider purchasing these things, because it will give you more control when users sign up through their email address for these other vendors. So I think that it's good to have visibility into your corporate machines and to take that visibility and turn it into something that you have a little bit more control over in the ecosystem. And if you're able to do that, a lot of times, like especially if you're looking at Slack or something, if you put in a corporate email, it's going to be like, hey, here are the people that are already using our product in your company, and that'll be a way for you to sort of move people over into these enterprise versions, and you'll give them more capabilities, which means that they're going to be more likely to use the corporate version over a personal version.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think of password managers too. I know a lot of companies who don't have a standard password manager. They don't pay for a license for everyone. I'm not really sure what the thought process is. Like, I know at one point people were like, oh, I'm afraid of, giving a password to a SaaS product, which I guess I get, but the idea is it's encrypted locally, then sent to them so they can't see the clear text. But then like take that thought another step forward. Where do you expect all your users to put their passwords? Or are they all, summer 2024, something like that? Like having a standardized enterprise password manager that everyone gets onboarded to and is paid for, so people aren't sourcing their own, is a huge win in that area too.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I sort of waffle on the password managers because like my personal view is I had this, I think we talked about this a little bit with 1Password, is like 1Password moved to a model where they no longer allowed you to control your safe, right? Like you have to put it in the cloud. And I really didn't like that move because I wanted to control the safe. I wanted to make sure that it stayed local, and I wanted that option so that I could keep everything locally on, my local network and not have to go out anywhere in the internet in order for me to find this password manager. So they kind of forced me into the convenience model. So I dropped them and moved to a password manager that I can use locally. But then on the corporate side, it's like people are sharing passwords and sharing credentials. And I know that we talk about like never sharing credentials, but I think this really comes up a lot when we're talking about SaaS providers. So like if you have a SaaS provider, Salesforce being one of the ones we've talked about in the past, where you have a shared credential and you don't have this automatic rotation capability, you have to use a shared credential for an API integration. Not all SaaS providers will allow you to automatically rotate credentials. And then there's always some sort of human in the middle that has to take this credential and place it somewhere for other people to get so that they can use it in their service. And then those have to get to a variety of different application engineers. So I think it's a bit naive to think that we can control all of the credentials safely without the use of these cloud service providers being able to share these passwords securely. But I think that fundamentally that security model is a bit flawed because we're kind of taking a concept that we, said was completely horrible, right? Don't share your credentials. Don't do these things. And then now that SaaS providers are on the scene, we're like, okay, it's okay, but as long as you use a password manager. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it is like you wrote a blog post about this, but the security absolutist of we want to have a completely secure environment and like we have to, we need to get to 100% secure. I think in the real world, as you know, we're always trying to get to 60, 70, 80, 90% secure. And I think one of the biggest battles we have in security is convenience over security. And the reason why people do shadow IT is to get around the 6-month approval process for third-party software. Because they just want to get their work done. That's what they're paid to do. That's what their boss is telling them to do. So I definitely get it, and I get the idea. People still don't like sharing sensitive info with cloud providers, which I get, and I think some of the password vendors may have kind of proven the point why you shouldn't. But I also think that it's a trade-off between a more secure solution that might use SaaS or just a completely insecure solution of passwords.txt that are getting shared back and forth on a file server. So
yeah,
I definitely get it, but I just think just always trying to move to a little more secure kind of posture.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're moving into this direction where it's like zero trust of your users, but full trust in your vendors.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know how I feel about that.
I mean, you're now where people were 10 years ago with cloud, and they're like, I don't know if I trust these people, and you've done a full circle.
Well, I think that you can apply these zero trust models to things. It's just thinking about it in that way. So one of the things we're talking about DevSecOps and 1Password and how we do all of these things and how we relate this to DevSecOps, and we're talking about logs and we talk about how we, I think it fundamentally comes down to how are we integrating these SaaS providers into what we would call before every phase of the SDLC, and how are we integrating them with other departments and things of that nature. So I think a lot of folks leave things on the surface where they'll trust a particular provider, but then they won't take the security principles to that provider and work with them. So let's say that they do offer logs. One Password as an example, we've been talking about them, so it's just top of mind, allows you to get their logs. So are people funneling those into their SIMs or SIEMs, as you would say? And you can use those logs to alert on when a particular credential is accessed, as an example. And 1Password would provide you with that. So if you have a shared credential and you want it under lock and key, you can create an alert in the same way that you could create like a root account access alert in your AWS accounts for these 1Password interactions with highly sensitive credentials. So if you have an API key that you know that you need to manually rotate every 90 days and somebody accesses it when you're not expecting, your security team should know about that. And folks like 1Password will let you know when that happens, but it's up to you to create that alert. Now, other providers like Okta and some of these single sign-on SaaS providers, they will raise certain security incidents to you, but you can't rely on just that to respond. So I think part of it is just our responsibility as security teams to think about how we can apply the security principles to these SaaS providers every single time and make sure that we consider every phase of the SDLC, or we consider the CSF to be like, what am I doing to reach these security pillars, these security principles every time I onboard a SaaS provider? And that's our responsibility. So, what is your rubric for onboarding a SaaS provider, and how can you incorporate them into your regular security pipelines?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Having kind of the do you have these things, and then the post, how do we integrate those things into our security ecosystem, logs, monitoring, whatever it is, user federation, all that kind of stuff. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that brings up another thing we talked about before the show, which is all of these tools have different ways that you integrate into them as well. It's not like if you start using a new service in AWS, it's going to be a different API, but it's going to have kind of a similar API spec. You can use the CLI, you can use AWS SDKs to write automation. Every single SaaS vendor is going to have a different API spec. Some might be GraphQL, some might be REST. Hopefully, if it's 2024 and you find a SOAP-based API with a vendor, run very far away from them. But the point is you have a lot of different API specs. And so if you're, the security team building the automations for this, you have to be able to quickly build solutions for each of those to integrate with them. So it's another challenge. You can't just, throw like a wiz.io in front of all your SaaS tools and get the level of insight you want into them. There are tools out there that are SaaS security tools, but they can't keep up with every single SaaS tool out there. They're not going to know that you uploaded a PCI doc to your to-do list. The number of SaaS solutions that comes out is insane, and they get adopted super fast, way faster than most vendors can keep up with them. So they're definitely useful tools to have, and they're really good for kind of the bigger SaaS, like file storage vendors, things like that. But you're always going to kind of fall behind with just having one solution. So you have to build some solutions as well.
Yeah. That reminds me too, is that put your security SaaS tools through the same rigor that you put all of your other SaaS tools through. I think too often we onboard security tools because we like them and we forget that we need to put them through the same rigor. And I'm certainly guilty of this. And if you start to unpack some of those security tools, they don't give you the same features that you need from these other tools. And I think it's your responsibility as a practitioner to be like, well, you don't meet this particular requirement. I do think that security tools generally get a lighter touch because of that, and that's kind of sad.
Yeah. I know of at least 2 breaches that happened because of security tools, which is very ironic, but it's not overly surprising.
Yeah,
they get a lot of privileges and they don't get enough review. So
I know we've got about 5 minutes left, and wouldn't be a show in 2024 if we didn't address the elephant of AI and machine learning in the room. And so one of the things that I think is interesting with software as a service and vendors is just how many of them are spinning up some AI or machine learning or ChatGPT integrated sort of bot or assistant or feature. How, as security practitioners, do you think that we should be looking at this in the lens of DevSecOps or even just in security in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it in just the data security side. So many of these tools, they want to take the data that they have, which is, if it's like a file share or some kind of data storage tool, it wants to take your data, train the model on it, and then feed you back information based on that. I saw an interesting talk at the conference I was at over the weekend that talked about a lot of the ways to protect against these things, but we still see, Amazon, huge company, obviously they've been in the AI space for a long time. They have their new chatbot Rufus for giving you like insight into user reviews for a product, but it's able to surf the internet and execute code. It's not executing code on the server, but it's writing code. And so they built this new tool and didn't really think through all the security. It has a bunch of kind of injectable issues with it. So even Amazon struggles with this, and their security is usually pretty good. So I just think, every SaaS vendor trying to build their own flavor of AI integration, chatbot or whatever it is, it's going to be a little bit of a mess, honestly. I don't think we've gotten our hands quite around the AI LLM chatbot issue, and so everyone rushing to build some flavor of it, whether it's valuable or not. I definitely think it's going to be a little bit of a mess for a while.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how it progresses because I don't think that we have good guidelines on how to implement this safely. We just talked about SaaS providers not including some of the basic security features out of the gate. And I think with all of these free tools, I think we have a similar problem with AI, and it's just really hard to defend against. I think seeing the big players struggle with it, like you're saying, is indicative of a hard problem. And I don't know. I think that I do believe that it is part of where things are going, and we need to figure that out. But I was just curious in your perspective, because for me, it's a bit scary to think that everyone is incorporating these things so fast because it's new and exciting, and I'm appreciative of that. But I just think that there's a lot of underlying security issues that we just don't know about yet. And I would be hesitant to incorporate that in anything, in any new feature, and just sort of let folks trial it before you, a little bit. It depends on, I guess, what your risk profile is, but, consider your risk when you're an early adopter.
Yeah. I don't think I would trust many SaaS vendors to use whatever data you store with them to train, even if it's a custom model for you, which I don't think a lot of folks are doing per user custom models. If they're doing like RAG, that's one thing, but I don't know. I think if you have sensitive data that you don't want exposed, I wouldn't quite trust the SaaS vendors quite yet in that way.
Like what's the use case?
As possible.
Like what's the use case, right? Like, if you're using something to like help you with language or something, maybe it's not the biggest deal. But if you're trying to send all your security incidents to the latest and greatest SIM, and it requires all these integrations, you might want to just take a beat and see. Honestly, any integration, any use of it is going to have there is something to consider there. You're putting data into in most cases, let's be honest, a free tool, and we know that if you're not paying for something, generally you're paying for something unseen, right? You're paying for it with something unseen. Yeah. So just keep that in mind as you're moving into those directions.
Yep. It's an evolving space. We don't have our arms around quite yet, but yeah.
It's true. Yeah. So for the last minute or so, anything that you wanted to discuss around SaaS that we haven't covered today, or any final words you want to leave the audience with?
I think if you're an internal security person or if you're a consultant working with your clients, I'd say, the 0 days, the fun hacks, the web application vulnerabilities, cloud exploits, those are all super fun. Those are interesting to learn about. But I can guarantee as much data that's in your cloud provider right now is probably also in some file share SaaS that your company is using. So it's not always as fun. It's not always as kind of sexy, but start digging through those providers you're using, start talking to people, figuring out what the security model of these tools are, and kind of, start to lock those things down, because decent chance that if you have a breach, it could be from one of those tools.
Oh, yeah. One of the things I tell people all the time, too, that just triggered, and I'll leave folks with this, is that if you check anything first, whether you're a pen tester or a security engineer or something, look for interesting information in whatever chat is being used at whatever company you're in, because it baffles me just what people will talk about in public channels on their private Teams or private Slack or whatever, and that data is typically retained forever.
Yeah.
And so, if you're a new employee and you're looking for something, you're like, I can't find this thing. It's just go search Slack or go search Teams or whatever. It's probably there. And I think folks just don't realize, what's in a public channel or private channel. So, treasure troves of information in SaaS providers. Have a look at them, review them, put your arms around them, and get some security eyes on those. With that, I think we'll end the episode, keeping it at 30 minutes. Sorry it took us so long to get to this one, but, as I always promise, we're trying to get better and better with our schedule, but it looks like folks are just wanting folks to travel a lot more this year. And so we have less and less time to record, and we're spending more time on the road. So thank you very much for listening again, and we'll see you next time.